From the stories to your homes. From K.L.P Studios in Atlanta, this is LTN News.
Hello everyone, welcome to LTN News. Here is today's highlights. The U.S. growth forecast for this year has been given the biggest downgrade among advanced economies by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, as a result of uncertainty caused by trade tariffs. Growth is now expected to be 1.8% this year, down from the IMF's estimate of 2.7% for the U.S. in January. The sharp increase in tariffs and uncertainty will lead to a significant slowdown in global growth, the fund predicts. The forecast for the UK has also been cut, with the economy now expected to grow by 1.1% this year. But the IMF has predicted UK economic growth will be stronger than Germany, France, and Italy. Inflation in the UK, however, will be the highest in the world's advanced economies, at 3.1% this year, largely due to higher bills, including for energy and water. The predictions come as top economic policymakers gather in Washington for the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank. IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas said the global economy still bears significant scars from the severe shocks of the past 4 years. It is now being severely tested once again, he added. President Donald Trump has made a flurry of announcements on tariffs this year, taxes charged on goods brought into the U.S. from other countries. In a growing trade war, the U.S. has placed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods, while China has hit back with 125% on U.S. products. The U.S. has also introduced a 10% tax on goods from the vast majority of other countries, while pausing much higher rates for dozens of nations for 90 days. Trump says tariffs will encourage U.S. consumers to buy more American-made goods, increase the amount of tax raised, and lead to huge levels of investment in the country. However, the IMF highlighted the potential negative impact on global trade given that modern supply chains are so interlinked. Uncertainty around trade policy was a major factor behind the growth downgrades, Mr. Gourinchas said. Faced with increased uncertainty, many firms' initial reaction will be to pause, reduce investment, and cut purchases. The IMF predicts the global economy will grow by 2.8% this year, down from its previous forecast of 3.3%, and by 3% in 2026. The downgrade to the U.S. growth forecast was due to greater policy uncertainty, trade tensions, and slower than expected consumer spending, the IMF said. Tariffs are also expected to hit growth in 2026. The IMF said the probability of a recession in the U.S. this year was now assessed at 40%, higher than its estimate of 25% in October last year. Earlier on Tuesday, banking group the Institute of International Finance said it expected a shallow recession in the U.S. later this year, with negative growth in the third and fourth quarters of 2025. China is expected to grow by 4% this year, down from the IMF's previous estimate of 4.6%. In the UK, the downward revision reflects the impact of tariffs, higher government borrowing costs, and weaker consumer spending as a result of higher bills and energy costs. However, the IMF's 2025 prediction for the UK is now close to the 1% growth forecast by the government's Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, last month. The IMF expects the UK to grow by 1.4% next year. Responding to the forecast, Chancellor Rachel Reeves said it showed the UK was still the fastest-growing European G7 country. The IMF's World Economic Outlook also contains the following forecasts. The Eurozone growth prediction is trimmed to 0.8% for this year from 1%. It is then set to grow by 1.2% in 2026, helped by higher government spending in Germany. Spain is the only advanced economy to see its 2025 growth forecast upgraded to 2.5% from 2.3%. This is partly due to reconstruction activity following floods. Canada's growth forecast for this year is cut to 1.4% from 2%, reflecting tariff uncertainty and geopolitical tensions. Mexico sees the biggest downgrade. It is now predicted to contract by 0.3% this year, compared with January's forecast of 1.4% growth. Forecasts are never perfect given the many factors that affect economic growth, and the IMF acknowledged its latest predictions had been particularly challenging. The figures given are what the IMF calls its reference forecast based on the situation as at April 4th, which was 2 days after Trump's announcement of wide-ranging tariffs. Mr. Gourinchas said that while the reference forecast was the IMF's central scenario, many possible paths exist, reflecting the unpredictability surrounding future trade policy and the varied impact of tariffs across different countries. The IMF also looked at the situation after the U.S. temporarily suspended many tariffs while raising those on China sharply. Mr. Gourinchas said the tariff pause did not materially change the global outlook from its reference forecast, because the overall effective tariff rate of the U.S. and China remains high and uncertainty about the policy continues. UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves said the IMF forecasts show the UK is still the fastest-growing European country in the G7 due to reform which will drive up long-term growth in the UK. Reeves added that the world has changed and she would be in Washington this week defending British interests and making the case for free and fair trade. However, Mel Stride, the Conservative Shadow Chancellor, said the IMF outlook was a worrying indictment of Labour's economic approach. The IMF has downgraded the UK's growth forecast, raising serious concerns about the lack of confidence and direction under Labour. They have also revised up significantly their forecast for inflation, he said. Next in world news, India and the US need to work together successfully for a prosperous and peaceful 21st century, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said in a speech calling for closer ties between the countries across sectors. Vance, who was on a 4-day visit to India, was speaking at a program in the western city of Jaipur. But I also believe that if we fail to work together successfully, the 21st century could be a very dark time for all of humanity, he added. The vice president's remarks came a day after he met Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and both countries said they had made progress in negotiating a bilateral trade deal which Delhi hopes will help it avoid higher tariffs. India is among a number of countries rushing to negotiate trade deals with the U.S. during President Donald Trump's 90-day pause on higher tariffs, which ends on July 9th. India was set to face 27% U.S. tariffs before the pause was announced. Since then, Delhi and Washington have been working towards an early conclusion of trade negotiations. In his speech in Jaipur, Vance said that the two countries had finalized the terms of reference for the negotiation. This is a vital step toward realizing President Trump and Prime Minister Modi's vision because it sets a roadmap toward a final deal between our nations, Vance said. He also called Modi a tough negotiator and someone who drives a hard bargain, drawing applause from the audience. Modi and Trump share a warm personal relationship. The Indian Prime Minister was among the first global leaders to visit Trump after his second term began. But the U.S. president has repeatedly taken aim at India's high tariffs, branding it a tariff king and a big abuser of trade ties. Even in the statement issued on Monday after Vance's meeting with Modi, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer highlighted the serious lack of reciprocity in the trade relationship with India. India has already cut tariffs on a number of goods in the past few months and is reportedly considering more wide-ranging cuts to pacify Trump. But sectors like agriculture, where Washington wants greater access, but India fiercely protects, are still sticking points. Vance also said in Jaipur that the U.S. is seeking to sell more energy and defense equipment to Delhi. On Monday, in addition to trade, the two leaders had also discussed cooperation in defense, strategic technologies, and energy. Trump wants India to buy U.S. corn, but here's why it probably won't. China warns nations against appeasing U.S. in trade deals. The Indian Prime Minister also said after the meeting that he was looking forward to welcoming Trump to India this year. Delhi is hosting the Quad Summit later this year, and the U.S. President is expected to attend it. The bilateral meeting was followed by delegation-level talks and a dinner hosted by Modi for Vance and his family. Vance arrived in India on Monday morning, accompanied by his wife Usha and their 3 children. Usha Vance's parents migrated to the U.S. from the southern state of Andhra Pradesh, and some media reports have said that Vance and his wife are keen to introduce their children to their Indian heritage. Photographs of the 3 children wearing Indian-style outfits, the 2 boys in kurta pajamas and 3-year-old Mirabelle wearing a lehenga on their arrival in India were splashed across Indian newspapers and websites. The rest of Vance's visit is largely personal. After the meeting with Modi, the family visited Jaipur city, where they visited the historic Amber Fort on Tuesday. The family is also set to visit the iconic Taj Mahal in Agra City on Wednesday before flying to the U.S. the next day. Next in the headlines, Harvard University has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration claiming that its freezing of federal grants worth billions of dollars is unlawful. Its president, Alan M. Garber, announced the action on Monday in a letter to the university community which said the $2 billion funding freeze would hamper critical disease research. Harvard, the world's richest university, last week rejected a list of demands that the Trump administration said was designed to curb diversity initiatives and fight anti-Semitism at the school. In response to the lawsuit, the White House said the gravy train of federal assistance was coming to an end. Funding cuts have also been implemented at other elite universities, and a new government anti-Semitism task force has identified at least 60 universities for review. President Donald Trump has accused universities of failing to protect Jewish students during last year's campus protests against the war in Gaza and U.S. support for Israel. Harvard has stood up to Trump. How long can it last? In Monday's letter, Mr. Garber said, the consequences of the government's overreach will be severe and long-lasting. Studies on pediatric cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease would be affected, he wrote. In recent weeks, the federal government has launched a broad attack on the critical funding partnerships that make this invaluable research possible, the school's lawsuit said. It said the withholding of federal funding violated Harvard's constitutional rights and was being used as leverage to gain control of academic decision-making at Harvard. The Trump administration has signaled that another $1 billion of federal funding could be suspended. Harvard receives about $9 billion in total annually, which is mostly spent on research. Harvard's tax exemption status and its ability to enroll international students could also be under threat. Mr. Garber, who is Jewish, acknowledged Harvard's campus, located in Massachusetts, has had issues with anti-Semitism but said he had established task forces aimed at the problem. He said the university would release the report of 2 task forces that looked into anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias. Separately, the Trump administration has targeted other private Ivy League institutions, including suspending $1 billion at Cornell University and $510 million at Brown University. Federal dollars also play an outsized role there in funding new scientific breakthroughs. Others, such as Columbia University, the epicenter of pro-Palestinian campus protests last year, have agreed to some demands after $400 million of federal funds was threatened. The demands to Harvard included agreeing to government-approved external audits of the university's curriculum as well as hiring and admission data. In response, Harvard released a blistering letter rejecting what it described as a takeover by the federal government. Former U.S. President Barack Obama, a Harvard alum, has said he supported the university, calling the cash freeze unlawful. The White House responded Monday night in a statement. The gravy train of federal assistance to institutions like Harvard, which enrich their grossly overpaid bureaucrats with tax dollars from struggling American families, is coming to an end. Taxpayer funds are a privilege, and Harvard fails to meet the basic conditions required to access that privilege. Polling by Gallup last summer suggested that confidence in higher education had been falling over time among Americans of all political backgrounds. That was partly driven, the survey said, by a growing belief that universities push a political agenda. The decline was particularly steep among Republicans. Next in film news, Sister Midnight, Santosh, and All We Imagine Is Light are part of a new wave of female-centered Indian films challenging the roles of traditional Bollywood heroines. They're unpredictable, sometimes humorous, sometimes sexually adventurous, and they're all leading characters rather than orbiting a man. The heroines of films including Sister Midnight, Santosh, Girls Will Be Girls, All We Imagine Is Light, and Shadowbox are giving international audiences a chance to see female characters from India who differ from most traditional Bollywood heroines. But do Indian audiences want to watch them, or will they even be able to? A feral bride in an arranged marriage that neither she nor the groom particularly want, Uma is the protagonist of Karan Kandhari's spiky comedy Sister Midnight, which premiered at the 2024 Cannes Film Festival and was nominated for a BAFTA. Well-known Bollywood actress Radhika Apte, who plays her, is shown struggling with household chores. Men are dim, her neighbor tells her. They'll eat anything. Just add chili and salt. Uma informs her awkward groom, who has gone on a week-long drinking binge, that he stinks and tells her employers sarcastically when they offer her a cleaning job that she's a domestic goddess. Told through offbeat dialogue, physical comedy, and a punkish soundtrack that includes Iggy Pop, Sister Midnight presents a heroine unlike anything else filmed in India, according to Opta. I'd never read anything like it before and I couldn't put it down, she tells the BBC. I was completely taken by Uma. She was this crazy creature, and I didn't know why I resonated with her, but I just did. It was going to be a very thin line playing her between it being really cool and it going wrong. And that excited and challenged me. I also like how unapologetic Uma is, and the more she accepts herself, the freer and stronger she becomes. Uma is the latest character that offers a different kind of female protagonist to Indian viewers, one who differs markedly from the traditional Bollywood heroine. Bollywood, the name for Hindi-language studio cinema, has historically dominated the Indian box office, making around $1.36 billion last year. But it's also been accused of being sexist and regressive in its attitude towards women. In 2023, a landmark study in India examined some of the country's biggest hits in terms of gender representation and sexual stereotyping, and found what they described as a formula to many of Bollywood's female characters. The female lead has to be thin and beautiful. She has to be coy and demure who expresses consent through gestures rather than words, but she wears sexually revealing clothing and has to be somewhat modern to allow for her to be in a premarital relationship, which is a transgression, Professor Lakshmi Lingam, the project lead for the study, told the BBC at the time. There's very little attempt to do something different. The depiction of both male and female characters on screen is important, she added, because in India, where families and schools rarely teach about sex education and consent, all our responses are influenced by books and cinema. By contrast, the male stars of the biggest Bollywood films of 2023 were described as led by alpha male protagonists with rippling muscles and blazing guns brandished on screen as they went on a bone-crunching rampage to vanquish their enemies. The hit films included Shah Rukh Khan's Pathan and Jawan, in which he plays a spy and vigilante, as well as the much-criticized, hyperviolent Animal, starring Ranbir Kapoor, a film accused of misogyny and objectifying women. It was made by Sandeep Redivanga, whose previous film Kabir Singh showed the male lead openly stalking and harassing a woman and was the second biggest Bollywood movie of 2019. There have been hit films showing women in roles of authority, including female rocket scientists in Mission Mongol, also one of the most successful Bollywood films of 2019, and films praised for a modern perspective on gender roles, such as Karan Johar's Rocky or Rani Ki Prem Kahani, Rocky and Rani's Love Story. But nevertheless, Shubhra Gupta, the film critic for daily newspaper The Indian Express, laments the lack of wriggle room India's leading ladies generally have in their roles. These heroines' overriding principle is demureness, she tells the BBC. You can have flashes of spirit, or you may speak your mind, but you'd also be just right in terms of beauty, and you'd be very clearly subservient to the leading man and whatever he is doing. You are pretty much always bringing up the rear, with a few scenes in which you get to shine. In Sandhya Suri's recent drama Santosh, however, a Dalit woman, from the lowest caste in Indian society, is as a police officer, with the authority that brings. Santosh inherits her husband's police officer job when he dies in service, something that's possible on compassionate grounds for government employees in India. Santosh, played by Shayana Goswami, is an enigmatic character who finds corruption in her local police force when a young girl is raped and murdered. She has a female boss, played by film and TV actress Sunita Rajwar, who has learned to compromise to stay at the top. Suri, previously a documentary maker, says she was influenced in making it by the real-life gang rape and murder in 2012 of a young woman on a bus in Delhi, which made worldwide headlines and led to new laws to safeguard women. Despite that, sexual violence against women and girls remains high in India, and a 2022 report found that cruelty by a husband or his relatives remained the biggest crime against Indian women. There were big protests at the time of the rape and murder, and I saw the photo of a female cop being confronted by some very angry female protesters. I saw that image and I saw the expression on the cop's face, and it was so enigmatic that I was just very, very taken by it. It was so interesting. She was at both ends of power. There was the possibility of violence against her, but it was also possible for her to mete out violence as well with that uniform, Suri tells the BBC. I wanted to know if you took somebody like Santosh, shut up in the kitchen of her house, and you put her in that place, what's her response to that, she explains. I wanted to ask if there was a way to be a woman that's not about being a man, and not about being oppressed. Is there some other way in her society in which she can be, and that there may be a line she steps over?
Santosh, which was made in Hindi, was the UK's Oscar entry for Best International Film in 2025. One attribute both Sister Midnight and Santosh share is that, though they were filmed in India, they're made by British Indian filmmakers. Sister Midnight's makers hope to release it in India in 2025, but Suri tells the BBC that Santosh will almost certainly not get a cinema release there. We screened it at the Mumbai International Film Festival and had a great response, and I was moved by just how real the film felt to a local audience, she says. But it looks like the film won't release in India, sadly, as it was admitted to the censor board, CBFC, and there were so many cuts, I couldn't maintain some semblance of a film. Indian censorship decisions have frequently caused controversy. In 2017, the decision to ban the feminist Indian movie Lipstick Under My Burqa for being too lady-oriented caused an outcry and was later overturned after negative publicity. But many homegrown blockbusters are self-censoring, especially when it comes to sex and sexuality. The 2021 Telugu-language hit Pushpa, The Rise, the story of a smuggler, removed a scene where the hero Pushpa, played by Allu Arjun, touches the chest of the heroine, Shrivalli, because of complaints from the audience. In 2024, Pushpa 2, the rule again caused controversy in India, according to Shubhra Gupta, because of an insinuation that Shrivalli, played by Rashmika Mandanna, might want to be sexually intimate with her husband. The female character acts very cute. She comes on to the hero and is very playful when she wants a little assignation, Gupta says of it. The rest of the film, she's serving the hero. She wants her husband not to have sex with anyone else. But in fact, it became a real talking point in India because it's not something heroes or leading ladies in the movies are supposed to have conversations about. And our mainstream film experience is still very much that if a woman has a sexual experience outside marriage, there will be some castigation attached to it, she adds. She won't be pure anymore. She'll be known as bold, which means she's been around. It makes K.L.P's acclaimed film All We Imagine as Light seem more audacious in terms of its exploration of sex. The first ever Indian winner of the Cannes Film Festival's Grand Prix is the story of a nurse, Prabha, who's been abandoned in her arranged marriage. Meanwhile, her younger flatmate Anu, a Hindu, wants to get intimate with her Muslim boyfriend, itself another taboo. There's no talk of marriage in advance. The film's about the preoccupations I've had for some time, Kapadia tells the BBC. Women in India can be financially independent, but there is still not a lot of autonomy with what you choose to do with your personal life. It's infantilizing women. You could be 25 years old, making your own money, providing for your family back home. But you can't decide who to be with or who to marry. Despite the accolades, All We Imagine as Light was not chosen as India's 2025 Oscar entry. The deciding jury called it a European film taking place in India. But it wasn't the only film by an Indian female director in 2024 that put a young woman's sexual awakening on screen. The English and Hindi language movie Girls Will Be Girls by Shichi Talati won the Audience Award at the Sundance Film Festival. Set in a boarding school in the Himalayas, it's the story of an 18-year-old girl who falls in love with a boy for the first time, but whose romance is disrupted by her mother. But Indian films breaking societal norms have found international recognition before, from Mira Nair's Monsoon Wedding, 2001, to Lipstick Under My Burqa, 2016, and 2014's LGBTQ+ teenage love story, Margarita with a Straw. Shubhra Gupta says there's still a vast gap between what an international audience react to and what mainstream Indian audiences will pay to see, given the high ticket prices in cinemas. These films we're talking about are part of independent Indian film, which is really where all the exciting things happen, and that's pretty much true of all world cinema, she says. Payal Kapadia has had a fabulous journey with All We Imagine as Light, and it did get a cinema release here. But I'm not sure how much box office it made in India. She adds that many viewers in India would react in disbelief to heroines such as Sister Midnight's Uma and Santosh were they able to watch the movies, as they are so unconventional. They wouldn't be able to suspend disbelief that in Santosh, a Dalit woman from the lower caste, would be made into the lead, that she's driving the narrative. It would be such a hard sell here, she says. And Radhika Apte's character Uma is a wife, but she is not submissive. She goes out there and does all these mad things. They are excellent films that might do well on a streaming platform, or they will find a discerning audience, but a discerning audience doesn't really make up the numbers that a big-budget Bollywood film will. But Indian filmmakers still have to try to break stereotypes for audiences, according to Tanushree Das and Sami Ananda Sahi, the directors behind Bengali-language film Shadowbox. The film, shown at this year's Berlin International Film Festival, is the story of Maya, played by Tilotmaya's home, who holds down several jobs and battles to keep her family going because her husband, a former soldier, struggles with his mental health and is frequently humiliated by the community because of it. When we're talking about working-class underprivileged women, the term from the margins tends to crop up, Das tells the BBC. But the margin represents a huge majority of our population. Where are their stories, then? It's high time we broke stereotypes, and to do this more women need to tell their own stories. I feel producers and distributors of film underestimate how large a viewership women represent, and their appetite to see stories where their lives are mirrored rather than projected in a tokenistic way. If cinema itself is not an option, the rise of the international streamers and OTT platforms, which allow viewers to watch content directly on their TV or through a phone app during the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a place for recent, more audacious, female-focused filmmaking. The Great Indian Kitchen in 2021 by Geo Baby, a Malayalam-language film, became a hit on the Apne stream, and versions of the story were also made in Tamil and Hindi. It's the story of an arranged marriage, and the film shows, from a female viewpoint, household drudgery, unpleasant in-laws and monotonous and painful sex with an uncaring husband, with one female critic saying of it that the film rips through patriarchy, the bedrock of the institutions of family and religion. Lapata Ladies, by Kiran Rao, which did become India's Oscar entry this year, also deals with an unwanted arranged marriage and was released on Netflix, as was 2020's Gunjan Saxena, which told the story of India's first ever female fighter pilot. But people are not actually buying a ticket for these, Gupta says. It's mostly 15 to 35-year-olds who are going to the movies, and often they happen to be young men. And the film industry is still a boys' club to a large extent. For more nuanced female characters to be seen in big-budget cinema films, ultimately Bollywood's lack of profits last year might be an impetus. After its bumper 2023, last year Bollywood only achieved 40% of the overall Indian box office profits, and Gupta says its formulaic films are part of the problem. People are hungry for something different, she says. But the problem is, if you take them too far out of their comfort zone, I'm not sure whether they're going to come to the cinema. So unfortunately, we've ended up maintaining this equilibrium so that people will come to the movies not expecting to see women who are feminists or women who do not ascribe to the idea of what a good woman should be. However, she adds, it's not just female characters who have to be written differently in order for change to come. I would say that if you want your women characters to be different, you also have to write your men differently too, says Gupta. There needs to be a cosmic shift across the board. Next in news steak, mashed potatoes and desserts for astronauts could soon be grown from individual cells in space if an experiment launched into orbit today is successful. A European Space Agency, ESA, project is assessing the viability of growing so-called lab-grown food in the low gravity and higher radiation in orbit and on other worlds. ESA is funding the research to explore new ways of reducing the cost of feeding an astronaut, which can cost up to £20,000 per day. The team involved say the experiment is a first step to developing a small pilot food production plant on the International Space Station in 2 years' time. Lab-grown food will be essential if NASA's objective of making humanity a multiplanetary species were to be realized, claims Dr. Akhil Shamsal, CEO and founder of Bedford-based Frontier Space, which is developing the concept with researchers at Imperial College London. "Our dream is to have factories in orbit and on the moon," he told BBC News. "We need to build manufacturing facilities off-world if we are to provide the infrastructure to enable humans to live and work in space." Lab-grown food involves growing food ingredients, such as protein, fat, and carbohydrates in test tubes and vats, and then processing them to make them look and taste like normal food. Lab-grown chicken is already on sale in the US and Singapore, and lab-grown steak is awaiting approval in the UK and Israel. On Earth, there are claimed environmental benefits for the technology over traditional agricultural food production methods, such as less land use and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But in space, the primary driver is to reduce costs. The researchers are doing the experiment because it costs so much to send astronauts food on the ISS, up to £20,000 per astronaut per day, they estimate. NASA, other space agencies, and private sector firms plan to have a long-term presence on the moon, in orbiting space stations, and maybe one day on Mars. That will mean sending up food for tens and eventually hundreds of astronauts living and working in space, something that would be prohibitively expensive if it were sent up by rockets, according to Dr. Shamsel. Growing food in space would make much more sense, he suggests. "We could start off simply with protein-enhanced mashed potatoes onto more complex foods, which we could put together in space," he tells me. "But in the longer term, we could put the lab-grown ingredients into a 3D printer and print off whatever you want on the space station, such as a steak." This sounds like the replicator machines on Star Trek, which are able to produce food and drink from pure energy. But it is no longer the stuff of science fiction, says Dr. Shamsel. He showed me a setup called a bioreactor at Imperial College's Bezos Center for Sustainable Proteins in West London. It comprised a brick-colored concoction bubbling away in a test tube. The process is known as precision fermentation, which is like the fermentation used to make beer, but different. Precision is a rebranding word for genetically engineered. In this case, a gene has been added to yeast to produce extra vitamins, but all sorts of ingredients can be produced in this way, according to Dr. Rodrigo Ledesma Maro, director of the Bezos Center. "We can make all the elements to make food," says Dr. Ledesma Maro proudly. "We can make proteins, fats, carbohydrates, fibers, and they can be combined to make different dishes." A much smaller, simpler version of the bioreactor has been sent into space on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket as part of the ESA mission. There is plenty of evidence that foods can be successfully grown from cells on Earth, but can the process be repeated in the weightlessness and higher radiation of space? DRS Ledesma Maro and Shamsel have sent small amounts of the yeast concoction to orbit the Earth in a small cube satellite on board Europe's first commercial returnable spacecraft, Phoenix. If all goes to plan, it will orbit the Earth for around 3 hours before falling back to Earth off the coast of Portugal. The experiment will be retrieved by a recovery vessel and sent back to the lab in London to be examined. The data they gather will inform the construction of a larger, better bioreactor, which the scientists will send into space next year, according to Dr. Ledesma Maro. The problem, though, is that the brick-colored goo, which is dried into a powder, looks distinctly unappetizing, even less appetizing than the freeze-dried fare that astronauts currently have to put up with. That is where Imperial College's master chef comes in. Jakub Radzikowski is the culinary education designer tasked with turning chemistry into cuisine. He isn't allowed to use lab-grown ingredients to make dishes for people just yet because regulatory approval is still pending. But he's getting a head start. For now, instead of lab-grown ingredients, Jakub is using starches and proteins from naturally occurring fungi to develop his recipes. He tells me all sorts of dishes will be possible once he gets the go-ahead to use lab-grown ingredients. "We want to create food that is familiar to astronauts who are from different parts of the world so that it can provide comfort. We can create anything from French, Chinese, Indian. It will be possible to replicate any kind of cuisine in space." Today, Jakub is trying out a new recipe of spicy dumplings and dipping sauce. He tells me that I am allowed to try them out, but taster-in-chief is someone far more qualified. Helen Sharman, the UK's first astronaut, who also has a PhD in chemistry. We tasted the steaming dumplings together. My view, they are absolutely gorgeous. Dr. Sharman's expert view not dissimilar. You get a really strong blast from the flavor. "It is really delicious and very Moorish," she beamed. I would love to have had something like this. When I was in space, I had really long life stuff. Tins, freeze-dried packets, tubes of stuff. It was fine, but not tasty. Dr. Sharman's more important observation was about the science. Lab-grown food, she said, could potentially be better for astronauts, as well as reduce costs to the levels required to make long-term off-world habitation viable. Research on the ISS has shown that the biochemistry of astronauts' bodies changes during long-duration space missions. Their hormone balance and iron levels alter, and they lose calcium from their bones. Astronauts take supplements to compensate, but lab-grown food could in principle be tweaked with the extra ingredients already built in, says Dr. Sharman. Astronauts tend to lose weight because they are not eating as much because they don't have the variety and interest in their diet, she told me. So, astronauts might be more open to having something that has been cooked from scratch and a feeling that you are really eating wholesome food.